Good afternoon, gamers. Jaraoh back. We've got some Riftbound decks of the week, and we have two decks for you today. One is a repeat, one is not. This is the one that is a repeat, of course. We've talked about set in the past. Basically, the tournament scene, I would by no means say is getting stale. That would be disingenuous. Just because the game is still obviously not even released yet in the West. But I don't really want to do a full-on what the meta is review when nothing has changed really, right? The top two decks are still by a mile Master Yi and Kaisa. Most people have concluded the right way to build Master Yi is mid-range. So you've got mid-range Master Yi, and then you have Kaisa, and then you have effectively a smattering of different Aurora type decks or some purple decks that are trying to poke their head in but are not quite S tier, I don't believe. So, where does that leave us? Because, I don't want to do a third video in a row basically about those two decks dominating the format, right? They are the most played. They are the most played for a reason. They're very good. But myself and others have talked them into oblivion already. So I wanna make sure that I highlight two decks that I think make a lot of sense in the format that are maybe getting a little less coverage, right? So the first one here we've got Set, which like I said we've talked about before. This is a list that is in first place, 4-0 in Stage 5 of an Ascension League. And I pinpointed this one because it was unique, right? But also, this deck is doing something a little different than other set decks that I've seen, and it's leaning into its strength, which I really, really like. So, other lists that I've seen of this in the past, it seemed like it had very undirected goals with what it wanted in the mid to late game. And what I mean by that is it was playing 1 and 2 of a lot of different legends, powerful, 4 to 6 range mana units, costed units. And to me, coming from my Magic background, usually, not always, but usually when you're playing 1 or 2 of a bunch of different cards that you could be playing 4 of, usually that means one of two things. The good version of it is you have a lot of card filtering and a lot of card access, and you need to diversify your options. So if you have the ability to look at a lot of cards in your deck, then you want some modality, right? Some versatility, so that you can have access to different effects across longer portions of the game than other decks will have access to. That is not what's happening here. This deck has very little card draw, very little access to cards. So this deck is going the other direction. It is basically maximizing the units that are the best for it, right? And that is 3 orange set, I should say, 3 Fiora, 3 Kiana. A lot of the lists that we've looked at in the past, we're playing 1 to 2 of a bunch of these. This deck just has identified the good cards, the good units that it wants to play, and it's just maxing out on them. And even though that seems like it's a simple concept, in practice, a lot of people don't actually pull the trigger on it, and it does make this list, I assume, perform quite a bit better than other lists that we're looking at. The other thing I like going on here is it's all in on its curve, right? It's got the full 9 2-drops, which is, I think, just excellent deck building for what you're trying to do here. Notably, I've already kind of hinted at it a little bit. I think this deck on Monastery of Hirana is probably as close to a... How do I want to phrase this? There is not a better combination, I don't believe, of Champion to Battlefield, right? You have Reaver's Row Kaisa, which I think a lot of people think is very good. Void Gate Kaisa, a lot of the Kaisa ones just because it's good. A lot of the Aurora decks with Aspirant's Climb or Obelisk of Power. No. The best single pairing of Legend to Battlefield is set with Monastery. It turns the deck into just a very generic aggro/mid-range deck, and turns all of your cards into also card advantage elements. And it ends up being basically an unbeatable machine on that battlefield. And I think the secret to set is lining it up in a way where you can win one of the other maps, right? Whether that be some kind of cheese element, Arena's Greatest. This one goes for God Willow with pump spells, or Hillock for ganking, which I think also makes sense. But yeah, Monastery is absolutely unreal, and I think you should expect to win most games if you play this deck on that map. Other notable things, I'm wondering if this deck starts with Yellow Set as its champion. And even though I think most people conclude Orange Set is better, I find it really interesting that because you're only playing the one of it, even though you have a little bit of modality, right, you can choose in between game. I wonder if most of the time you're just starting with this set because it's lower curve, so you can play it a little bit earlier in the game if you were hypothetically on, going first. And it also really leads into your lower drop curve, right? It can just be larger more quickly. I think the rest of the deck makes a lot of sense, right? We've seen the Arena Bars before. It's a very important card in this deck. We've seen the Showstopper, very important card with the deck. Showstopper and Call to Glory are kind of this deck's highlights, in my opinion. This is the package where you're literally just cheating the game on an element that other decks don't have access to, right? Annie kind of has it with the Readying Runes mechanic, but realistically, just other decks aren't prepared to play around tricks for this cheap of a cost, right? At least not these powerful of effects. Hidden Blade, obviously, a rock star here, and probably is a deck where, even though you're not playing tokens, you are probably targeting your own creatures as often, if not more than your opponents. And I think that's an interesting dynamic, again, because, a lot of the other yellow decks have token elements, right? They're playing, Vanguard Captains, or they just are the Victor ability, or they're playing the Manufacturer, which makes a recruit, right? So the fact that this deck probably Hidden Blades its own things more than those decks is pretty goofy. And you'll also notice for deck building here, this deck does not play Cold a Week for the same reason, right? You just really can't afford it. Your units are so much more important than sacrificing them to your own Innocent Blood type effect to make a Magic comparison. Other notable things that this deck is doing, I think this sideboard with the current meta that we have looks just phenomenal to me. And obviously Set is the only one that has access to this. Having access to Unyielding Spirit, which I think most people have concluded is just one of the best cards that you can have against Kaisa. And then Salvage, which is one of the best cards that you can have against Aurora. And then Leona, which is one of the best cards that you can probably have against Yi. And then Sabotage, which is just a very good universal one-off to have if your opponent is like playing something spicy or you're trying to set up a one-turn win. So this sideboard looks awesome to me. The only thing that I would maybe consider changing is I would go down to 2 Salvage, just because it's so cheap and you don't necessarily want to have a bunch of them in your hand before the Aurora comes down. So I might, and then Sabotage is kind of the same thing, right, if you're going to bring it in that matchup. So I might be looking at a full 2-2-2-2 split. But I just wanted to pinpoint that this sideboard looks incredible to me. And, you look at a lot of sideboards these days, and until you get the games in yourself, it's kind of hard to manage. What were they thinking with these numbers? What are their plans? I think this plan is very direct, and all these cards are just absolute bangers, right? That's generally my philosophy in sideboarding with Magic, and there's 2 different schools of thought on that as well, or potentially even more than 2, which is some people, I don't want to, go on too much of a Magic, rant, because I know a lot of people don't necessarily know those connections, but in Magic, there's a lot of people that will play just more efficient versions of cards you already have access to. Cards like Spell Pierce, or Annul, or in a more modern sense, you something like Mystical Dispute. And that's a fine approach, making your deck leaner and more consistent. I tend to err on the side of wanting the bangers, wanting the cards that are maybe a little flashier, and maybe a little harder to cast, but they're unique effects to your deck, right? Instead of making your deck leaner and more efficient, you're bringing this new element, this, like, point of power. And I kind of think this sideboard does that really, really well. Because Salvage, obviously, not an effect you can get elsewhere. Leona, kind of an effect you can get elsewhere, but I think putting it on a unit versus a spell makes a lot of sense. Sabotage, there is no other card like it. And Spirit, you could argue it's kind of like a glorified Defy, but not really, right? Because it has a bunch of modality that Defy has, and then Defy has, modality that Spirit does not have. They function differently, but ultimately kind of the same in the Kai'Sa matchup. So yeah, I think this deck is quite good. I think it does still suffer from the flaw of being very dependent on Arena Bar, which is a little surprising that it only plays 2, in my opinion, just because you want to spin your buff so aggressively. But I think it's very dependent on Arena Bar, and I think it's really, really hard to maneuver your games where you're not on Monastery. So that would be my only drawback to this deck. But I do still think that this deck is particularly powerful and has legs that you should be looking into if this is an archetype that you're interested in, which is, good aggressive shell, leaning into a mid-range plan where basically the plan is you're just going to dominate the board the entire game, right? You're just going to brute force it because, in theory, your units, or at least your good units, should never die. So that's going to be set, and then we're going to move on to the next one. This one is a fun one. This is one that has my interest peaked. As you can see from the layout, this is a deck that got second place by Sold Out in Runes and Rift. This top 8 was 4 Kai'Sa decks, an Annie deck, a Darius deck, and 2 Master Yi decks. And Kai'Sa did go on to win the event. It beat this deck in the finals. Sold Out then put out a tweet or a comment in Piltover, I think it may have been, where he comments that he went 10-2-2 on the event. Great record. And beat Kai'Sa several times throughout. And I think there's a lot to talk about here. So, why Annie over Kai'Sa? Why would you choose Annie when you have access to Kai'Sa? So there's a couple things going on here. First and foremost, I think you need to look at how you're approaching the meta, right? And you have access to a lot of the same red cards. Falling Star might be harder to cast, obviously, than it is in Kai'Sa, but you still have access to it. You have access to a lot of the same early red units. You have access to Void Seeker. You have access to Cleave. You have access to Darius. You have access to Kai'Sa. If you look at the Kai'Sa shell, and you look at all of the cards that are in blue and red, it turns out that you actually are just cold to Vi Ride the Wind. That is a combo a lot of people are very excited to play. It effectively is a 2-card combo that guarantees you 2 victory points in the mid to late game, the turn that you go for it, against particular archetypes, right? There are archetypes that have counterplay to that. Master Yi, for example, right? Because they're going to be playing Defies. They can also realistically put much more power onto a battlefield than a deck like Kai'Sa can in the mid to super late game. But against Kai'Sa specifically, if you are looking at just the head-to-head matchup, it's not that Annie counters Kai'Sa. I don't think that that's true. I don't think anything counters Kai'Sa, right? But you do have avenues of play that are hard counters to anything that they can set up. Because again, if they're setting up a big unit attack, you have access to Rebuke, Fight or Flight. Flash is kind of the wrong example because that's just pulling your back. You can't deny them the point for the sake of this argument, right? Because obviously Kai'Sa has something like Retreat. But when you're talking about denying that 7th and 8th victory point, they just don't have the same tools that Purple has, right? Purple has Gust, Fight or Flight, Rebuke. And that interaction is crazy, crazy powerful. Because when you're getting into this trading dynamic, if you have a line that you can set up that they can't counter, then the pressure is on them to act more aggressively, right? If the board is like kind of stalled out and you're both trying to trade these like accelerated units and you're both at 6 victory points or 5 victory points, they are then under a lot of pressure to try and end the game over the course of a turn or two, because if they ever let you go into a turn with 6 victory points, they're in danger of losing, right? While that is true for you as the ante player as well, you have counterplay, right? You can set up scenarios where you can interact with the boards that they try to set up. That's not true for them. Another thing going on here is this deck, as you'll notice, does not actually have expensive cards. Kai'Sa, generally speaking at this point, will have some number of Time Warps in the sideboard. They're all playing Watcher, which Watcher is a completely filthy card, right? They should be playing 3 Watcher. But because this deck isn't actually leaning into a bunch of the expensive cards, that is its trade-off for being able to recycle resources early in the game, right? And not feel like it's falling behind. Because it's not trying to ramp up to these Watchers and these other, like, big, beefy units. You can kind of stay on low resource counts most of the game and function just fine, right? That's a really good value. That's a really good place to be in deck building, and it lets you play these powerful cards like Rebuke and Falling Star. Another thing going on is, because you can function on low resource counts, the Annie legend ability of Readying Runes, generally speaking, is going to be crazy, crazy good for staying tempo positive. Because imagine the scenario where if you're playing on a non-Targon's Peak map, which Annie usually doesn't want to do that because you already have that effect, right? And there's not like a ton of value in leaning into a second copy of that. Annie can usually play 2 or 3 units to the board early, or set up like an early Kai'Sa Darius situation, and then being able to pass the turn into any of these very powerful cards, right? Flash being the most common, but Fight or Flight or Rebuke also, or even just Gust, Cleave interactions. Anything, even Stack Deck. Being able to get access to 2, 3, maybe even 4 extra spells within the first 2 or 3 turns of the game should put you far enough ahead that you can initiate a tempo lead and a victory point lead. And that's going to be pivotal in this archetype. Because, again, all you're really trying to do in most matchups, but Kai'Sa in particular, is just get to 6 victory points. If you get to 6 victory points, they can't stop you from winning with Vi. And that's a really, really interesting concept going forward. Again, specifically in the Kai'Sa matchup. Another thing that this deck is doing that's less targeted at Kai'Sa and just more in general good deck building, the Traveling Merchant Zon Warren synergy is just, it just ends up being very, very good. Like, so obviously you don't want to ever be on no cards. No decks really function well that way. But because you care about putting cards into your graveyard, because Vi, and you have Stack Deck, you end up having an insane amount of reach in this deck. Now, I'm using that term a little differently. In Magic, reach kind of means like ability to close the game while you're low on cards, but your opponent has stabilized the board. In this terminology, I'm using it as you have the ability to just sift through. I guess deck velocity would be a better term. You have so much deck velocity here. No other color combination has Stack Deck, right? That card is incredibly powerful. Zon Warren's other archetypes can play it, but we're probably one of the better archetypes at using it. And this ability to just sift through your deck lets you play these very, very powerful cards that would generally have a pretty low floor but high ceiling. And it lets you get away with it at a much better rate, with the argument being, if you draw Gust, say against a Master Yi deck, and you don't want that, or against an Aurora deck, and it doesn't do anything for you, another deck that doesn't have access to the same discard, that would be a massive liability, because one of your crucial draw steps was taken up by this very situational card that is only good against small unit decks. Because you have access to all of this loot effect, you can play one Gust and then have access to it in your deck when it's phenomenal, and then just discard it when it's bad. That's an insane ability for a deck to have. And then you'll see that Sold Out leans into that with other parts of his deck building as well. One Rebuke, one Falling Star. Falling Star is a very, very good card, but drawing a bunch of Falling Stars in a deck that doesn't have the Kai'Sa Legend ability can be a drawback. It can cause a lot of problems for you to progress your plan for the game going forward. Only having one of them and being able to consistently find it when you want it is a big boon to your deck. And Rebuke functioning effectively the same way, right? The ability to be able to just pick it up when they go to play a Deathbloom Predator or any kind of massive unit, a lot of times that's going to be the game-winning play, right? So I also like the sideboarding here, which because you're already playing your very powerful one-ofs, you end up in this scenario where, like I mentioned with my philosophy of deck building for sideboards, I want bangers. This deck gets to play the bangers in the main deck because the liability of drawing them when they're bad is just less relevant because you can discard them. But also what's going on here is you just get to maximize your full deck building. In Magic, we have this term called, it's like, I brought a full 75. I didn't bring a 60. And what that means is that your sideboard is integral to how a lot of the games play out. And this deck does the same thing. In a matchup where this... My cats are going absolutely psycho. In a matchup where Gust is good, you have access to the full 3. Some matchups aren't going to have the ability to play the one Gust main deck, and they're not going to have the sideboard slots to play the full 3. Because you can play the 1 and the 2, you get access to the full 3 when they're very good. Falling Star, same thing. Rebuke, same thing. You're just leaning into the strengths that your deck already has. These are cards that are already in your main deck, but have a massive difference in floor and ceiling based on where you draw them and in which matchup. And then you have Fading Memories, which is a different version of Rebuke in the sense that it's like just a big monster interaction, right? It just lets you mess with a big unit that's on the board. Very good to have more types of effects like that, especially when you expect Yi or other Aurora decks to be very popular. And then you just have Vayne, which is very, very fluid in the way that it will let you just help you close through some games. It performed very well in the Kaisa matchup for me, for example, where a lot of times you get into this weird gimmicky trade where you don't actually want to defend your battlefield because you can't defend very well as Annie. That's kind of not what she's designed to do. You're much more trying to take over on your turn, get the point, and then flash your guys back or retreat your guys back. Vayne plays that game exceptionally well because she does it on her own without requiring another card. And yeah, so I think when you piece all of that together, this is a deck that I have a lot of interest in, obviously is capable of doing very well in a Yi and Kaisa-dominated format. And I also just think you get to play some very, very cool cards. These are a lot of the kind of tricky spell interactive cards that I enjoy playing, right? Like, this is going to give me some slack, I'm sure, but in Magic, I'm much more of a blue player. I like playing a lot of the finicky card draw spells, gimmicky removal and counter spells, and kind of winning games, by a thread than in big, landslide victories. So this deck is very appealing to me, and I think it will be appealing to a lot of people going forward, if for no other reason, just because I think Vi Ride the Wind is very fun. I think people are drawn to, 2-card, 3-card combos. This one is pretty hard to interact with. It's not impossible to interact with, but pretty hard to interact with. And yeah, I think that this is something that you should consider going forward as well. I think this does ultimately have more play than the set deck, for example, but it's also very clearly a different archetype. So you kind of have your pick of the litter, right? You kind of have your choices on which outlet you want to pursue. All right, guys, I think that's going to do it for us this week on our decks of the week. Hopefully we'll get some fun things to look at after release here. I think maybe, even though most of the events will still be online, of course, hopefully there will be some more innovation now that people actually have the cards in hand, and maybe they'll be, playing IRL with their buddies and bring some new spicy stuff to the online tournament scene that way. But I think that's going to do it for us. And if you enjoyed the show, you enjoyed the vibes, go ahead and throw me out a like, comment, and a subscribe. I would appreciate it very much. And that's going to do it for us. Until next time, peace!